Of all the theories surrounding the Idaho 4 murders, this is one that carries the most weight, not in evidence, but in consequence. It's a theory that does not target a stranger. It doesn't look outward, it looks within, inside the house, at the only two people who survived. They lived at 1122 King Road. They were inside the house on the night of the murders, and when the police arrived nearly 8 hours later, they were alive, untouched, and unharmed. From the moment their names were released, questions began to spread. Why didn't they call 911 sooner? What did they see? What did they hear? And are we sure they told the full truth? The theory that the surviving roommates may have been involved in the crime, either directly or indirectly, began like most things now, online. Inconsistencies were highlighted, gaps in the timeline were picked apart, and the absence of public statements from either Dylan or Bethany became fuel for speculation. The key factors that fueled speculation include the delayed 911 call, nearly 8 hours after the estimated time of death, the claim that Dylan saw a masked intruder but didn't intervene or call the police immediately. Bethany's complete silence in the official records fueled more suspicion, along with no confirmed explanation for their movements between 4:20 a.m. and noon. These aren't accusations, they're the points where uncertainty lives, and in the absence of clarity, speculation fills the void. This theory doesn't survive because of hard evidence, it survives because of human doubt. Because people struggle to believe that 4 students could be brutally murdered in the same house without someone else inside knowing more, doing more, saying more, and because in most crimes of this nature, proximity matters. False accusations have ruined lives. They've driven survivors underground. They've tainted investigations. So here, in this episode, we do not assume, we do not blame, and we do not leap to conclusions. We ask carefully, are there unanswered questions about the survivors that deserve to be explored? And if so, what are they really telling us? This isn't about guilt, it's about clarity, and it begins with what we know and what we don't. Before suspicion, before theories, before whispers turned into accusations, there was the affidavit. It is the official, sworn document that outlines the case against Bryan Kohberger, and it's the only place where we hear directly on record from the surviving roommates, Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funke. Dylan lived on the 2nd floor of the King Road house. According to the affidavit, she was awake around sometime at 4 a.m. on the morning of the murders. She reported hearing noises that she thought was Katie playing with her dog. She reported hearing a male voice saying something like, "It's okay, I'm going to help you," along with crying believed to be coming from Xana's room. Crucially, she also opened her bedroom door 3 times. On the 3rd, she saw a man dressed in black, wearing a mask over his nose and mouth. He had bushy eyebrows. He walked right past her toward the sliding glass door and left. Dylan closed the door and stayed in her room. She didn't call 911. She didn't attempt to exit the house. Instead, the next known action from Dylan was to text Bethany and eventually run down to her room, where it is reported she stayed awake for a while, browsing social media among other activities on a mobile phone. The 911 call was eventually made at 11:58 a.m., nearly 8 hours later. This timeline, more than anything else, is what raised alarm bells online. Bethany is mentioned in the affidavit. She lived on the 1st floor and was reportedly at 1122 King Road through the entire incident. There is no record of her hearing, seeing, or saying anything. She is never quoted, she is never described. In legal terms, she is present but silent. It's important to note what the affidavit does not say. It doesn't accuse either roommate of wrongdoing, and it doesn't imply that they were involved. Neither does it suggest that their stories conflicted with the evidence. Dylan's description of the man in black, including the mask and bushy eyebrows, was used to strengthen the case against Bryan Kohberger, not cast doubt on her own role. But the document also leaves many questions unanswered. Why didn't Dylan call for help immediately after seeing the intruder? Did Bethany hear anything at all? What did they do between 4:20 and 11:58 a.m.? The affidavit gives us a glimpse, not a full view. It tells us what Dylan said, and what Bethany didn't. It builds a timeline, but it doesn't explain the space between the lines. And until it does, the questions, fair or not, will keep coming. If 4 people are murdered in the middle of the night, and 2 others are inside the same house, why does no one call for help until almost noon? Is the question that's hovered over this case like a storm, and for many, it's the crack in the timeline they cannot explain. But before we judge that silence, we need to understand what happens inside the human mind when it experiences trauma. According to official documents, the attacks occurred between approximately 4 and 4:25 a.m. Dylan Mortensen was awake. She heard sounds and opened her door multiple times. Finally, she saw a masked man walk past her, and then nothing. It's easy to say, I would have called straight away, but trauma doesn't follow logic, it follows instinct. Psychologists call it disassociation, the brain's way of protecting itself when overwhelmed. In moments of intense fear, the body can freeze, time distorts, perception narrows, the moment becomes unreal. Fight or flight are well known, but there's a third response, one just as natural and far less understood: freeze. In life-threatening scenarios, many people shut down. They become still, they retreat into silence, they wait, hoping danger will pass. This isn't weakness, it's biology. In other cases, school shootings, home invasions, acts of domestic violence, survivors have remained silent for hours, even days. They've hidden in closets, pretended to sleep, left crime scenes without calling police, not because they didn't care, but because they couldn't process what had just happened. So could the survivors have been confused? Well, possibly. Dylan may have believed she saw something strange, but not something fatal. She may have thought her housemates were arguing, intoxicated, or playing a prank. Bethany, asleep on the first floor, may not have known anything had happened until the morning. By the time the horror was clear, shock may have already taken hold. But does this prove innocence? No, but it does provide a plausible, psychologically grounded explanation for why the call came so late. And in absence of other evidence, sometimes understanding is more valuable than accusation. 8 hours is a long time, long enough for suspicion, long enough for doubt, importantly, long enough for any cleanup attempt. But in the mind of someone traumatized, 8 hours can pass like a dream, or a nightmare you're not ready to wake from, and maybe, just maybe, that's all it was. Every high profile becomes a story, and every story, in the age of the internet, becomes a battlefield of opinions. Facts blur, timelines bend, and speculation takes center stage. In the case of the Idaho 4, no one outside of Bryan Kohberger has received more scrutiny than the 2 surviving roommates, Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funke. But how did it get here? And has the pursuit of answers turned into something else entirely? It started with the affidavit. Dylan saw a masked man and didn't call 911. Bethany was reportedly home as well and said nothing. 8 hours passed, no action was taken, and in that vacuum, the public began to ask, why? The questions weren't unjustified. They were driven by shock, confusion, and a deep need to make sense of the unthinkable. But not all curiosity is constructive. Soon after the names of the survivors were released, social media platforms filled with accusations suggesting that they must be involved, or that they're hiding something, or even that they helped. Questions such as how could they not know were asked. These weren't just questions anymore, they were judgments, delivered by strangers with no evidence and no consequences for being wrong. Online sleuthing had its place, but it also had a cost. False accusations can damage reputations, ruin mental health, distort public perception, and undermine real investigations. And in extreme cases, they can even create new victims out of those who survived. So what is fair to ask? There is a responsible way to question what Dylan actually did see, and why there was a delay in calling for help. Also, have both survivors been fully cleared by investigators? These are valid inquiries. They are grounded in the pursuit of truth, not in the need for a villain. What isn't fair is assumption without evidence. It takes someone's silence, their trauma, their uncertainty, and turn it into guilt, because justice comes from evidence. Speculation is natural, but it must be anchored in discipline, not desperation, and until we separate what we know from what we fear, we risk turning victims into suspects, and truth into noise. So could Dylan's account be fabricated or flawed? When Dylan Mortensen's account was first revealed in the arrest affidavit, it became one of the most talked about and most scrutinized details in the entire case. According to her own report, she opened a bedroom door 3 separate times during the early morning hours of November the 13th. The first time, she believed she heard Kaylee playing with her dog. The second, she thought she heard crying and a male voice reassuring someone with the words, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." The third time, she saw a man, dressed in black, mask over his nose and mouth, with bushy eyebrows. He walked past her towards the sliding glass door. To some, Dylan's account seemed incredibly precise. The detail of bushy eyebrows was quickly noted, and later echoed by law enforcement in connection to Bryan Kohberger's physical description. But for others, the story felt oddly composed. The calmness with which it was delivered, and the specific sequencing of events raised eyebrows. How could someone describe such an encounter, and yet not call for help? Not immediately, not within the hour, not until nearly noon. It was this conflict between vivid detail and apparent inaction that led some to question whether Dylan's account could have been exaggerated or even invented. There's no hard evidence to suggest that Dylan fabricated a story. She wasn't charged. She was not publicly named as a suspect. Her statements were used by police to strengthen the case against Kohberger, not to shift suspicion elsewhere. Fabrication would require motive, and motive, in her case, is difficult to establish. What would Dylan gain by inventing a story that placed a killer inside the house? Why would she describe an intruder at all if she had something to hide? Furthermore, when Kohberger was in the sights of law enforcement, her description aligned closely with what we know about him. The clothing, the mask, the build, and the timing of the Elantra leaving the neighborhood. To fabricate such specific elements would mean creating a lie that accidentally aligned perfectly with known evidence. So could it simply be flawed? Well, that's a far more reasonable possibility. Trauma distorts memory. The brain under duress does not process time or detail in the same way it does in calm conditions. Dylan may have misinterpreted sounds. She may have only seen a shadow, a silhouette, or a flash of movement. Her account, while clear in retrospect, may have become clearer over time, especially after she was interviewed, guided through timelines, and exposed to media coverage. It's also possible that her description was rooted in partial memory, pieces reconstructed into a more coherent narrative. This isn't deceit, it's how the mind often works in moments of terror. Dylan's account is the only eyewitness statement placing an unidentified person inside the house during the time of the murders. That gives it power, but it also places pressure on her, an enormous weight to bear, especially when so many are desperate for clarity. Critics have argued that the timeline of a sighting, if accurate, contradicts how quickly the attacks must have taken place. But timelines in violent crimes are rarely precise. Emotions compress and stretch time. Memories fold under pressure. Another theory floated online suggests that Dylan may be protecting someone, perhaps a known individual who was in the house, or someone connected to the crime in ways not yet revealed. But again, there is no evidence to support this. Law enforcement has not suggested she withheld any truth, and she has not been implicated through forensic findings or witness contradictions. And if she were protecting someone, why offer any description at all? Why create a masked man with bushy eyebrows unless she believed or truly saw that image? Memory is not a courtroom transcript. It is fragile, emotional, and vulnerable to suggestion. Could Dylan's account be flawed? Possibly. Could it be fabricated? Possibly. Could it contain a mix of truth and confusion, shaped by fear and adrenaline? Almost certainly. In every story, there's someone who fades into the background, someone whose silence is mistaken for simplicity, for passiveness, for irrelevance. But sometimes, silence isn't passive. It's strategic, or protective, or simply unbroken by choice. In the case of the Idaho murders, that person is Bethany Funke. Bethany lived on the first floor of 1122 King Road. According to the affidavit, she was home on the night of the murders. But unlike Dylan, Bethany reportedly heard and saw nothing. She's named in the official affidavit. She doesn't give any quotes or specifics, no further elaboration. Beyond that, she disappears from legal record. This absence has become one of the more haunting elements of the case, not because it implies guilt, but because it offers no clarity. What did she do during that time? Did she lock her door? Did she hear any footsteps? According to the affidavit, we know that they met up in Kaylee's room before all going to their own rooms. But what happened next? Did she move around the house the next morning? We don't know. And law enforcement has not released those details. So was she interviewed by police? Almost certainly, yes. There's no reason to believe that law enforcement ignored her. Her phone, her digital footprint, her social media, all would have been examined. She likely gave a statement, but those documents remain sealed, and the public is left with a blank page where her presence should be. In cases like this, survivors matter deeply, not only for what they saw or heard, but for what they didn't. Bethany's silence creates a narrative vacuum, and vacuums attract speculation. Some theorists have taken her absence as proof she's hiding something. Others believe she slept through the entire ordeal and was simply stunned by what she awoke to. We know that according to the court affidavit, she was awake during the ordeal and texting Dylan Mortensen. Both views rely on absence, not presence, not fact. So could her silence be a form of protection? Well, it's entirely possible that Bethany is traumatized, or under legal instruction to remain silent. It is also possible that she is trying to live beyond the noise, and that she played no role, has no insight, and simply remains silent because she has nothing to add. We don't know, and for now, we shouldn't pretend to. Bethany's name has been dragged through internet forums, TikTok and YouTube thumbnails. People want her to speak, to explain, to tell them something that brings sense to the madness. But silence is not admission, and in the world of trauma, sometimes silence is survival. Bethany Funke has remained invisible, not through guilt, but through choice. And until the facts say otherwise, we owe her the same thing we owe every survivor of violent trauma: the benefit of the doubt, and the space to speak if and when she's ready. In any criminal investigation, clearance comes in two forms. You're cleared by confession, or you're cleared by evidence. And in the case of the Idaho 4, the surviving roommates, Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funke, have been cleared by neither, but they've also not been named as suspects. So what does the physical evidence really say? Were they excluded by forensics, or simply never considered at all? The forensic focus has always been upstairs: the victims' bedrooms, the knife sheath, the blood evidence, the DNA profile found on the snap button. Those pieces formed the foundation of the case against Bryan Kohberger, but almost nothing has been released about the first floor, where Bethany Funke was sleeping, and very little is known about the condition of Dylan Mortensen's room on the second floor. That information has not been disclosed. We know police combed through the kitchen, living room, bedrooms, hallways, and bathrooms. We know they collected swabs, fibers, blood samples, and digital devices. But we do not have an itemized forensic breakdown of survivors' spaces. No mention of what was or wasn't found in their rooms. No lab analysis published that ties them to evidence or rules them out. Were the survivors tested for DNA or blood? Well, we don't know. Standard procedure in a case like this would include collecting clothing, fingerprints, and swabs from anyone inside the house, including survivors. But there's no public confirmation that Dylan or Bethany were tested for traces of blood, transferred DNA, or evidence of cleanup, and that absence leaves the door open, not to guilt, but to ambiguity. So it raises the question, could innocence be assumed without testing? No. In a quadruple homicide, everyone inside the scene should be subject to equal scrutiny, if only to eliminate them as suspects and strengthen the case against the person ultimately charged. But the affidavit, court documents, and search warrants have been narrowly focused. They mention a single suspect, a single weapon, a single point of forensic connection. There's no official statement that the surviving roommates were tested and cleared. So why does this matter? Because when the public hears that they weren't involved, they assume that conclusion is based on scientific proof. But as of now, there is no public proof, no confirmed gunshot residue swabs, no negative DNA results tied to survivor materials. The silence isn't suspicious, but it's not reassuring either. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but it is a gap. And until we know for certain that the surviving roommates were forensically examined, cleared, and documented in the chain of investigation, then cleared remains a presumption, not a conclusion. Every time the timeline falters, every timeline the silence deepens, a darker question lingers beneath the surface. What if the killer didn't break in? What if they were let in? And what if someone inside the house wasn't just a witness to what happened, but a part of it? This is the inside job theory, a hypothesis that suggests one of the survivors may have knowingly or unknowingly helped the killer gain access to 1122 King Road. It doesn't necessarily imply malice. It could mean a mistake, a door left open for someone they thought they knew, a party guest invited, a stranger introduced as a friend, a split-second decision that led to disaster. But at its darkest, it suggests complicity, that someone inside the house may have opened the door knowing what would happen next. The front door of the King Road home had a keypad lock, a code system. The sliding glass door at the rear, which opens onto the second floor, was reportedly less secure. According to the affidavit, the suspect likely entered through that back entrance. The inside job theory suggests that someone may have given the killer access, either by sharing the code, leaving the door unlocked, or physically opening it that night. But so far, there's no direct evidence to suggest that happened. No text message, no call, no digital trail. Some believe the killer moved through the home with way too much confidence. They entered, bypassed the first floor, attacked on the second, then proceeded to the third in the dark without hesitation, or the other way around. That kind of precision has led some to wonder, did someone inside provide directions? Was this a targeted attack with inside intel? There's also a subtler version of this theory. What if someone inside the house knew the killer, was manipulated, threatened, or coerced into silence? What if their failure to call the police wasn't confusion or trauma, but fear? Could that explain Dylan's delay, Bethany's absence? Could the look on the masked man's face, the one who walked past Dylan, have meant more than just anonymity? While intriguing, this theory relies heavily on speculation. There aren't any phone records, messages, or evidence to suggest this. While there are known links between Bethany Funke, Dylan Mortensen, and the victims, along with mutual friends and social media interactions that place them in the same orbit, there is no sign of a cover-up. The inside job theory offers something that pure randomness cannot: control. It makes the horror feel explainable. It gives the killer help and the victims context. But that desire for logic can create its own distortion. It turns survivors into suspects and grief into suspicion. So could someone have helped? Maybe. But until there's evidence of a message, a meeting, or a moment of betrayal, this theory remains exactly what it is: a question, not an answer. In true crime, the story doesn't always end with the person who makes the 911 call. Sometimes the survivor isn't just the witness. Sometimes they're the one responsible. History has taught us that not everyone who lives through a murder is innocent, but it has also taught us something just as important. Those who are guilty almost always leave clues. There was the case of Diane Downs in 1983. Diane Downs drove her children to an emergency room in Oregon. One was dead, 2 were wounded. She claimed they had been shot by a stranger during a carjacking, but investigators noticed inconsistencies. Her story shifted. She showed little emotion. Forensic evidence didn't match her version of events. Eventually, it was discovered that Diane herself had pulled the trigger. Her status as a survivor quickly dissolved into that of a perpetrator, but not before the world had briefly believed her. There was the case of Susan Smith in 1994. Susan Smith had told police that a black man had carjacked her vehicle, with her 2 sons still inside. The nation searched, prayed, hoped. 9 days later, the truth emerged. She had drowned her own children. She wasn't a survivor. She was the killer. Her life collapsed under the weight of forensic truth, and public trust shattered in its wake. There's a disturbing case of Nico Jenkins' cousin, Erica Jenkins. In a string of murders in Nebraska, family members initially posed as unaware, Erica Jenkins presented herself as a relative caught in the chaos. Later, she was arrested, charged with murder alongside her brother. She was present, then silent, then exposed. Her role shifted only after forensic evidence forced the truth. So what do these cases have in common? Well, they began with a survivor, a witness, a narrative that cast them outside of the crime. But soon, the pieces don't fit. Inconsistencies emerge and timelines fracture. Emotion feels misaligned, and most importantly, forensic evidence begins to contradict their version of events. That's when the shift happens, and that's when suspicion becomes accusation. So does the Idaho case share these traits? So far, no. There's no confirmed inconsistencies in Dylan or Bethany's stories. No trace of defensive wounds, hidden injuries, or unexplained behavior. No forensic reports that links them to blood, fibers, or weapons. No public evidence of lies. There is silence. There is a massive delay. There is trauma. But there is no evidence, not yet, that they played any role in what happened. There are also theories suggesting that they may have been involved in a cleanup attempt, which goes a long way to explain the delay in the 911 call. So why is this important? Because it reminds us that survivor involvement is rare, but not impossible or unheard of. And when it happens, there are almost always red flags, connecting accounts, illogical behavior, contradictory forensics. And in the Idaho case, we don't have those signs yet, at least not publicly. History warns us not to blindly trust the first narrative, but it also warns us not to destroy someone based on assumption. When survivors lie, the evidence usually finds them, but until that evidence exists, they remain just that, survivors. 10 chapters, hundreds of facts, and a single question. Could one of the survivors have been involved? It's a theory that sits uncomfortably on the edge of what we know, fueled by silence, gaps in the timeline, and public disbelief. But now, at the end of this part, we ask plainly, does the theory hold up, or has it collapsed under the weight of the facts? The theory asked good questions. Why didn't Dylan call police sooner, whilst Bethany remained completely silent? Were their rooms searched? Were they tested, ruled out, or ever even investigated? These are fair inquiries, especially in a case this brutal and this quiet. The theory also pointed to the eerie calm of the crime scene and the killer's apparent knowledge of the house's layout. Could that imply inside help? On paper, yes. But theory must answer to fact. The facts aren't all too simple. There is no known submitted evidence tying either survivor to the crime. No blood, no fingerprints, no DNA, no attempt to destroy or hide evidence, which has been submitted in Kohberger's defense. Dylan's description of the suspect helped build the case against Bryan Kohberger, not shield him. Bethany's silence, while frustrating to some, is not proof of complicity. There are no contradicting witness accounts, no motive, no opportunity that fits a timeline of violence and escape. And without those, the theory begins to unravel. At its core, this theory is about discomfort. Discomfort with silence, discomfort with inaction, discomfort with the idea that something so horrific could unfold without more people noticing or stopping it. But discomfort is not evidence, suspicion is not proof, and speculation without facts is just noise. So could it still be true? Well, anything is possible. But in criminal investigations, we don't ask what's possible. We ask what's likely, what's provable, what holds up under scrutiny, and what seems more plausible on the balance of probability. Dylan and Bethany lived through something unimaginable. They were young, terrified, and possibly paralyzed by shock. Could they have done more? Definitely. Could they have seen more? Possibly. But have they done anything to suggest guilt? So far, questions have been raised. But until the facts say otherwise, they remain what they were on the morning of November the 13th, 2022. Survivors, not suspects. This concludes part 5 of our investigative series, the Idaho 4 Theories Beyond the Official Narrative. In this episode, we examined the most controversial theory of all, that the survivors may have played a role. What we found was not proof of guilt, but the importance of precision, the power of evidence, and the cost of speculation. In our next part, we turn our focus outward once again, to another theory that has lingered since day one. Was this a case of mistaken identity? If you find this episode thought-provoking, we invite you to like, comment, and subscribe.